with and for our 80+ congregations in the Chicagoland area. And so with that, trauma healing that is informed, that is practical and spiritually engaged, that's what these webinars are about. And we are pleased to be in partnership to do this. So welcome to everyone. We are up to 90 participants at this point.
Wonderful. We're so grateful. Speaking of 90 participants, I do want to also acknowledge the careful work that has been happening with the Presbytery in terms of getting the word out, partnering with us first of all, but also getting the word out. And also want to appreciate also our staff at McCormick Theological Seminary, our president, our dean, and in particular, the Office of Alumni Relations and Community Engagement, headed up by Reverend Nanette Banks, and also Richard Mayo, who handles our social media engagement, also Lisa Dager, who handles also a lot of our community awareness in terms of our newsletter that goes out. Of course, our support from the Dean of the Seminary, Steve Davidson, and also our President, David Crawford. I see those lovely faces. I want to acknowledge them and appreciate them. And with that, let's get into our presenters. Our first presenter is Stacy Williams. She is an educator with the University of Chicago program here. She does an important work around coaching educators around dealing with trauma and stress. She'll say a little bit more about that when she gets on board and offers her presentation. She will be our first speaker. Our second speaker for the morning is the Reverend soon-to-be Dr. Devona Aline. She is a licensed professional counselor with Millennium Consulting and Counseling. She'll be offering our practical tips. And then we also have the Reverend Susan Crummell, who is the executive presbyter for the Chicago Presbytery, and she will bring our spiritual insight and faith discussion towards the end. So with that, let's get started. We're going to toss this off to you, Stacy. We'll need you to go ahead and open up your sound, and here we go.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I am getting our slideshow going. So there we are. It's good to be with you all, and it's always really encouraging to see the interest and the concern and the response. So as Dr. Crumpton mentioned, I work with schools and educators. We have a project out of the University of Chicago called Trauma Responsive Educational Practices. And it really is a deeper look at the effects of trauma on learning, behavioral regulation, and what that means for the challenges in our schools. And one of the key factors that we are addressing, and I'll talk about this more during our presentation today, is around equity and how the effects of trauma really make behavioral, emotional, and cognitive regulation so difficult that we end up oftentimes punishing folks, especially children, for things that are entirely outside of their control. And so my role today is to help us understand in a more simplified way, and hopefully a way that you can articulate and share with others, what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about trauma? Where in the brain does it have the most impact, and how does the brain and body connect and result in some of the things that we're feeling even now with COVID-19. So with that, I want to kind of lay out what is trauma. And so it starts with a traumatic event. We're talking about a singular major event. It might be several moderate events, but it's an event. An event is not the trauma, but a traumatic event is different in that it causes the risk of losing one's life, the life of a loved one, or the invisibilizing of someone's personhood. And so trauma is actually the individual's response to that traumatic event. And because of this, it's unique to every individual. Not every individual will experience the event the same way, and not every individual will experience a traumatic event as trauma. And that has to do with their resources. It has to do primarily with their relational resources. Relationships heal. And if there's a takeaway I want everybody to have from this, it's the power of relationships to heal. But when a person does not have access to those supportive relationships, that's when we start talking about traumatization. And that moves into the lasting effects on the brain and body. We also talk about developmental trauma. And in developmental trauma, that's when trauma is experienced early in life. We're talking about between birth to 5. I was on a call recently on a national level where we were talking about even in utero, so that the pregnant mother who experiences a traumatic event or ongoing traumatic events, their brain and body are releasing chemicals that go directly to the developing fetus. And so in utero, we can be steeped in trauma. When we are talking about COVID-19, we're talking about something that is different than the individual experience of trauma. Now we are talking about collective trauma. That is where a cataclysmic event that is shared by a group and shatters the fabric of the society. It shakes the bonds that bind us, and it causes a crisis of meaning. In a collective experience of trauma, it is required, in a collective experience, it is necessary that the pathway to healing is also a collective experience. Now, there will be, and there are individual responses as well, but it's a both and. And when we start talking about healing and recovery, it's also both and at the individual level and the collective level. In the case of COVID-19 right now and a global pandemic, we are in the midst of that cataclysmic event on a global scale, so that everybody on the planet at this point in time and going forward will have shared in this traumatic event. Historical trauma has yet to come for COVID-19. Historical trauma is where there's a cumulative amount of experience over time, and it affects particular groups in ways that are more concentrated and long-lasting and across the generations. And so when we're talking about historical trauma, we really are needing to engage conversations around systemic oppression, around systemic racism, around the ways that epigenetics has shown us that trauma gets in our bones, in our DNA, and gets passed down. So with that understanding, there are kind of 3 E's of trauma that I'm going to click one more time to see. So actually, hang with me. I'm so sorry. I'm going to stop the screen share because it picked up a different set of slides, and I really want to get the neurobiology. So hang with me really quick. Sorry, technical difficulties, be patient with me. Okay. There we go. Okay. Should be back on track.
Awesome.
Okay. Thanks so much. I'm so sorry about that. I realized we were missing this important piece. So really, I want to take a step back here around what is it that we're talking about, the areas of the brain that are most affected. So what we know in the neuroscience of trauma is that it's primarily located, not summarily, and definitely dependent on the traumatic event and what is going on for the individual. But it is primarily located in what we call the prefrontal cortex. That's the frontal lobe. It affects, we're talking about kind of the area of the brain that is in charge of logic, reasoning, processing, organizing language, making meaning of language. And folks may be familiar with the term executive functioning that has become popular in the last decade. That's where all of this lives. Time management, organizing your thoughts, being able to kind of manage the day-to-day things. The hippocampus is deep inside the brain. It is under, as you can see in this image, several layers and lobes, and located at the center of the brain. It is known to be primarily responsible for learning and memory, spatial recognition, and moving short-term memories to long-term storage. The other area that we kind of see much more visibly with folks who are impacted by trauma is the amygdala, because this is the area that's responsible for decoding emotions, for detecting threats, and for calming once a threat leaves. It's also the area that connects sensory input to memory. So one way to think about this area is that when you might smell something cooking and it brings you back to a childhood memory, or you might have the sensation of sun on your back and it brings up a memory of being someplace. And so the amygdala and the hippocampus, they work together around memory and emotion. When we talk about the effects of trauma on the brain, what we experience in these effects is from that prefrontal cortex is a lot of disorganized thinking. It also, in the moment of experiencing trauma, it works to preserve energy and resources, even blood flow, to the most important parts of our body, our heart and our lungs, and keeping us alive. So it shuts down any sort of higher reasoning and language structures. In this experience, somebody who is in a heightened state of trauma might not even be able to hear or make sense of words. And that's really important, because when you're trying to speak to someone who is in that heightened state, the voice sounds more like that Charlie Brown voice that is indistinguishable if they can hear it at all. And so it's not a time for complex instructions. It's not a time that someone's going to be able to have a rational conversation with you. It just needs to be focused on getting to calm and keeping safe. On the hippocampus, it really limits learning and memory. One of the key impacts is that it limits the ability to bring those stress hormones back down. So in times when we are continually activated at the traumatic level as ongoing trauma, then our bodies don't get the opportunity to return to a state of calm. And that is where a lot of the brain and body impacts come from. The amygdala gets stuck on an overactive threat response and feels like it's detecting danger all around. it often will keep us in a hypervigilant state. Sometimes we talk about kind of the radar always being up. And so it can make the triggers more intense, and it can cause a purely emotional response that then is not able to do that processing from the prefrontal cortex and doesn't have the aid of the calming hormones. So it just continues to go up and escalate. So when we are particularly talking about the effects of trauma or being able to explain this to others, what I point out to people is, first of all, going back to these three areas. We're talking about the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. We're talking about logic and reasoning, being able to learn and remember and store memories, and our emotional center. We're talking about individual trauma and collective trauma, and what will become historical trauma of this event. And one way to think about it are these 3 E's of trauma. So it's the event itself that is a traumatic event. And then the experience of that traumatic event is what becomes trauma. And the lasting effects are where the brain and the body get impacted. When we're talking about, particularly with COVID-19, I wanted to point out a couple of particularities during this time. So the experience of the traumatic event, the ability to cope through it, and the ability to recover from it are directly impacted by social relational resources and access to those supports. It also is directly related to what we call compounding factors. So an example of this is a house that burns down on Christmas. It's a car accident that happens on your street in front of your house. It's a injury to your body that created a disability and a loss of a job. Those are compounding factors. When we are here in the midst of COVID-19 and you think about the experience of this event, it is global. And because of social distancing, we all are being limited to our access to our relational supports. We all are experiencing compounding factors. It's not just the illness, it's the illness and then the loss of the job. And for some folks, it's the illness, the loss of the job that created the loss of the housing, and now we've lost a family member. These are the compounding factors that make this especially kind of a extreme and intense state that will have lasting effects. Particular lasting effects that are going to be in our brains and our bodies and our generations going forward. So I know that's a lot. I want to point you towards a couple resources and to emphasize that what we know about the neuroscience, the physiology of trauma, and even the most extreme cases of collective and individual trauma is that relationships heal. The power of relationships to heal is limitless and so important to hold on to in this time. I work with the University of Chicago on a project that's specifically school facing, but our resources are they're all free, available to all. So those resources are found at TREP, T-R-E-P, Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Educator. There's a lot of information on there for how to be able to bring an understanding of trauma-informed education into various settings and things to be aware of. We also are offering a course right now that is free. We just ask you to register so that you can receive, so you can have access to the platform. But that also is found on the TREP Educator site, and there's a link here. And then not lastly, but I'm going to turn to Vanderkolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. It is incredibly helpful to connect the dots and make sense of how our brain and body are connected through these experiences. And then lastly is this link that we've provided, because there are a number of studies in the last 5 years around the power of nature, and that even looking at a picture of nature for 5 minutes can have the physiological effect of reducing the stress hormones in your brain and body. So this is also on our website, and it just provides these pictures of nature to scroll through and take a moment. But I want to put that in your kind of toolbox for yourself and for sharing with others, the importance of just sitting in front of a sunlit window, getting out on your porch or your patio or outside if you can take a walk, and just taking in nature can be incredibly healing and buffering and resilience building. So with that, I will close. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Stacy. You've been amazing. Again, Stacy is with the Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Project with the University of Chicago. A couple of just kind of highlights: the importance of understanding that what we're experiencing is emotional, but it is also actually related to the brain. So thank you so much for your insight around brain science. And also another important piece that I recall, several pieces, but the importance of recognizing that there are compounding factors that are influencing how we're experiencing our mental health right now in this time of COVID. And with that, we want to go ahead and move over to our next presenter, Reverend Dr. Devona Aline. She is our mental health practitioner on the line, and Devona, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Something you said about the crisis of meaning. We're basically talking about things not making sense. And if we can be honest, the time that we're in, things don't make sense. One of the resources that we have at our disposal is the ability to take a breath. So wherever you are, however you're sitting, just take a moment to take in a deep breath and release it. And now I'd like you to be very aware of whatever you're sitting on, whatever your hands are touching, whatever your body is touching right now. And then listen to what you hear, either in the room or either to my voice. And if there are any scents around, inhale that and notice it. The reason that I'm pointing out all of your senses is that's one of our resources while we're socially isolated and dealing with the variety of things going on around us. Dr. Williams mentioned what happens in the brain, where we're essentially replaying the video and trying to make sense of things that ultimately don't make sense. So as I'm framing our time together, I'm giving you some practical things that you can do to stop the video from playing in your head and come into the present moment. At the end of the previous presentation, mindfulness was mentioned, and that's a part of what can ground us during this time. It is an extraordinary time, and one of the things that come up with my clients and the people I talk to around me is this dissonance. It's extraordinary, but we're trying to be ordinary. I'm trying to do the same things I've always done, even though I'm doing it from home, or I'm doing it without interacting with the people I normally interact with. And so one of the things we have to acknowledge is that this is not a normal time. And so our normal ways of being might not work the way we want them to. Some people ask, you know, what is it? I'm not leaving the house. What's the big deal? I want to show you an image. I'm going to share my screen. I'll show you an image here. Can everybody see that or not yet?
Not yet. Let's
Not
see.
yet. Okay. Here we go. Here we go. Why is the coronavirus triggering mental health issues? There are a lot of things happening in your brain, in your body that you may not be aware of. We very quickly had to switch from just living to survival. How do I avoid getting this virus? Some people may be hopeless with the situation with the job and then not being able to connect and then just generally being lonely. And our financial security is threatened. We're worried about ourselves, but we're also worried about our loved ones. And are we doing the right things to keep ourselves safe? All of this leads to this feeling of despair. And that's why we're not feeling our best, even though it seems like things haven't changed. They really have. And with as much going on around us, I'll give you a couple of more seconds to take a look at that. With as much that's going on around us, we're focusing on that when really our focus might need to be internal and be very introspective. So with this extraordinary time, our expectations have to shift. What are we capable of? Can we do everything we've always done? Absolutely not. Can we do some things so that we don't fall off? Certainly. Ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? And my favorite emotion when clients come to me, I'm feeling some kind of way. That's not the answer to give yourself. Give yourself a real answer, an emotional answer, not I feel that, because that's a thought. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling terrified. Give yourself a real emotional answer to how am I feeling right now? And that question you want to ask at different times of the day just to build your emotional awareness, your emotional sensitivity to yourself. Now, for some people, that might be challenging because we do a lot of thinking. But how are you feeling? If you can't name it, do you feel it in your body? Am I tense? Is my chest tight? Am I struggling to breathe? One reaction to trauma that we often have is that we take short breaths, shallow breaths. So pause. How am I feeling? Breathe in the air around you. Give yourself a feeling. Am I tired? Do I need to take a nap? Am I thirsty? Have I had enough water today? Am I hungry? Do I need to eat something? One of the things we tend to neglect in our busyness and trying to get everything done, and we're taking care of kids, we're doing schoolwork, we forget just the basic things that regulate our mood. 3 things: sleep, nutrition, and exercise. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating at least every 5 hours? Once every 5 hours, and is it balanced? And then, am I moving? I appreciate the mentioning of Bessel van der Kolk's the body keeps the score, because trauma tends to be stored in the body. So if it's just a matter of pacing in your house or pacing around your structure, move. What that does, especially walking, is bilateral stimulation. That's something happening on both sides of your body. I am EMDR trained. That's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That's a trauma therapy that involves less talking, but more focusing on the thing that's bothering you while there's some form of bilateral stimulation on both sides of your body. If you're stuck in the house, you can still do this. One of the things I tell people to do to calm themselves is butterfly taps. I don't know if you can see that. I'm just alternating on both sides of my body. And when you're feeling super anxious, you can calm down this way. Some people go to sleep this way. If you're in a meeting, I don't know if you can see me, you can sit and just tap your elbows just to bring things down. People are really worried about their mental health during this time. Like, why am I feeling this way? It's a natural stress reaction to the potentially traumatic events and confounding events that are in the air. So avoid pathologizing yourself because you're anxious. there is a very real threat and we're having a reaction to that. But when you're feeling that and you're feeling overwhelmed, there are ways to bring yourself down. Breathe, tap, lean on sleep, nutrition, and exercise. And then find new ways to connect with the people that are already in your circle. I have some clients who hate Zoom. I appreciate it because I can see people's faces. I can connect. We're a texting generation. Pick up the phone and give somebody a call. I don't think we've talked on the phone enough in our time, and this is an opportunity to go back to that as a way to connect. But connection is very important. The other thing from that introspection and changing our expectations is really evaluation. Does it work? Did it work for me to eat a couple of pieces of chocolate cake to make myself feel better? Maybe in the short term, but what about the longer term? I'm still going to need something nutritious. One of the ways to evaluate is simply, what did I do today? My divinity training is in the Jesuit tradition, so I lean very heavily on something called the examine. And basically it's a 5-step thing for at the end of the day or the end of something to see, okay, how did this go? Usually you look for a divine presence, just being with the thing that gives you meaning. That may be God for some people, it may be nature, it may be community, but invoking that thing and having it with you. And then looking for the gratitudes. What was good for me today? What was good to me in the midst of this quarantine that we're in? What did I really enjoy? And then review it. Go through the list. What were my motives? What were my intentions? What did I mean to happen? And that may bring up some sorrow for what didn't happen the way I wanted it to. And step 5, you sum all of that up and ask for grace. You know what? I didn't do as well as I wanted to. Here's what I want to do tomorrow. One of the things to remember, there are no shoulds with this time. I tell people when there are shoulds, you're shoulding all over yourself, and nothing about that sounds good. We're all doing the best we can. So as you change your expectations, you look inside and determine, how am I feeling right now? And you evaluate how it went. Tell yourself that you did the best you could, because that's all any of us are doing as we're trying to cope. Remember to sleep, get your exercise however you can get it, and also try to eat well and connect with others. That's the framework of what we're trying to do, and that might look different for all of us as we navigate what works best, because what works for me might not work for you. I like chocolate cake. I'm gonna have some chocolate cake. That may not work for you. You might have better habits than I do. I do want to touch on using substances to cope during this time. I love a good bourbon, and I'm sure some others do too. However, as we're coping with drinking more, maybe using cannabis in some kind of way, you want to be sure that you're not trying to solve a problem and then create another problem. So just being, again, very mindful. How am I feeling right now? What do I need to do about those feelings? It might not be reaching for a substance. It may be that need for a connection. You might be hungry. There may be some physical things that you need to do to counteract the internal, potentially traumatic effects that are happening for you. If you are in recovery, this can be a difficult time. So there are a series of meetings that are happening on Zoom. Google it, reach out to your professionals to find those things. Resources are available. The key for all of this is just being very aware of yourself. Nothing, if all else fails, use your 5 senses. What are you seeing, hearing, smelling, feeling, tasting in this moment? Because that stops that record from playing and brings you to the present moment, and then gives you information for what you need to do next. And that's all I have. I'll be open to your questions at the end of our time together, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Crumpton.
Thank you so very much, Reverend Devona. This was incredibly helpful. I appreciate, especially because I might be in the chocolate cake ministry, as I made a run just before I made a run last night. Yeah, I made a run, and there were pastries involved. But on the more serious side, to not solve a problem yet create another problem, right?
Yes.
And your emphasis on reaching out was incredibly helpful and supportive. Thank you so much. Now we want to move into matters of faith. And so we'll go over to the Executive Presbyter of the Presbytery of Chicago, Reverend Sue Cromo. Please go ahead and lead us into this space.
Thank you. We're going to look at some scripture. First one is from Matthew 20, a parable that you probably know. I think it has special meaning for us in this time. For the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for the vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, the very latest time that he could go out, at the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? They said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the householder, saying, these last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day, and the scorching heat. But he replied to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? I think this parable is especially important right now. You have members of the churches that you serve and other people whom you know who just lost their job through no fault of their own, who are worried about how they're going to feed their families, worried about whether they're going to be able to pay their rent. And this parable, I think, has meaning for them. You all can figure out how to preach that and teach that to them. It also has a lot of meaning for those of us who are professional religious people, because we are about to come up to Easter Sunday. And I know that some of us are thinking, but how can it be Easter without fill in the blank, without me getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning so that I can be at church in time to do the sunrise service and then help the kids make the scrambled eggs that they have to make for the Easter breakfast, and then change my clothes and do the 8 o'clock service, and then change my clothes again for the 10 o'clock service, and go home and cook Easter dinner for my family and then fall into bed. How can it be Easter if I'm not doing all of those things? There are other things that you can't do right now, whether you're a deacon or an elder or a pastor or a caring friend in your congregation, your religious community. People have died in the last few weeks, whether from this illness or from something else. You have not been able to be with their families. You have not been able to be at a funeral, perhaps. You've not been able to comfort them in the way that you want to. And so you think, where is my worth in the middle of this? How can I still be me and do what I'm called to do if I can't do all of those things? This parable is in part a reminder to us that our worth has never been based on our labor or even on who we are. Our worth, our salvation come from God. And those things are based on who God is, not on who we are. God's love for us is not dependent on how much work we can get done in any one day. God's love for us is a gift and is given because God is generous to us, not because we earned it. And then I want to turn to the book of Ruth. You know, that Hebrew scripture near the beginning of the Old Testament. My mom always taught me, you get the first 5 books of the Bible memorized, and then there's a little sentence, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. It's a sentence. And that's how you find the book of Ruth. It's only 4 chapters long, kind of a short story. It's a little family story. It starts with a woman and her husband, Naomi and Elimelech, and they live in Bethlehem. Now, when I was in seminary and translating the Hebrew for the first time, I got to that first part of the book of Ruth, and it says there was a famine in the house of bread, because Bethlehem means house of bread. I wasn't looking for the word Bethlehem. I was just translating every Hebrew word when I got to it. So it says there was a famine in the house of bread. Things didn't go right even at the beginning of this story. Because of that, Naomi and Elimelech and then their two little boys had to move to Moab next door, and probably thought they would live there for the rest of their lives, which the men actually did. Because after they got there, the little boys grew up and became men, took wives, and then all three of the men died. Elimelech and both of the sons died. So here's Naomi in a strange land, a widow with two other widows in her house to take care of. Not a great thing at any time, especially long ago in the Middle East. But oddly enough, Naomi owned a piece of property still in Bethlehem, which also is very odd at that time for a woman to own a piece of property back home where she came from. So she decided she was just gonna brush the dirt off her feet from Moab, head back home, find some people she knew, live in the little house she had there, and see what she could do. One of her daughters-in-law said, okay, I guess I'll just go home, when Naomi said, girls, go home, I can't take care of you. But you know, Ruth said to her, no, not gonna happen, old lady, I'm going with you. Now, this is the whither thou goest speech. You probably have maybe read this at a wedding, or maybe you've heard it at a wedding. It's kind of odd unless it's a wedding of two women, because this is a love between two women that is being talked about here. But in any case, this is where Ruth says to her, I'm going with you. I promised my husband I'd take care of you. I've kind of come to believe in the same God you believe in, and I'm not sending you down that road back to Bethlehem by yourself. I am going with you. Now, oddly enough, when you read this story, the way Naomi reacts to that is this. When Naomi saw that she, Ruth, was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Naomi kind of goes, meh, and turns around and walks down the road to Bethlehem. Ruth has just made this impassioned speech about how she loves her, she's going with her, she'll take care of her. Naomi just turns around and walks back to Bethlehem. Then the Bible tells us, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is that Naomi down there? Do you think that's Naomi walking toward us? And this is what Naomi, whose name meant sweetie, said to them. She said, call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara, which you know means bitterness. Remember that from the Exodus where they got the bitter water from the well? For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, she says. I had a husband, I had two sons. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Remember, Ruth is standing right next to her, but she says, I went away full and I came back empty. I have nothing. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Now, I was reminded of this story because some of us are angry at God and we feel bad about that. We want to say, what is the deal? How is this happening? Where are you? What is happening in the world? I don't understand it. And the reminder of this story is that it's okay to be angry at God because God can take it. Go ahead and be angry. I mean, Naomi, you know, you kind of want to say to her, I recommend the decaf. I mean, she is mad when she gets back to Bethlehem. But remember how this story goes? They settle into that little house. They figure out what to do. The neighbors bring, you know, meatloaf and jello for a while, but then that runs out and they have to figure out how they're going to feed themselves. Naomi remembers there's a law that a man in their family ought to marry Ruth. And so she arranges for them to meet and they marry and a child is conceived. And it's not only a child who is born into this place where this woman has been so mad at God. It's actually King David's grandpa who is born, and you know who comes then in David's line, So here's this woman who was angry as she could be at God, and Jesus is her great, 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 great grandson. And then I want to tell you one other story. This is a story about a funeral that my husband and I actually did several years ago. We were co-pastors at First Presbyterian Church in Burlington, Iowa, and there was a little girl who was kind of a shirt-tail relation to the congregation who died, and died quite tragically. She was shot in the head by a playmate. The circumstance was that these little children were out playing on a Sunday morning in the neighborhood where they lived. One of the children found a gun that had been thrown under a porch by a felon as he was running away from the police. But of course, the children didn't know it was a real gun. So they were playing with the gun, and another child had the gun in her hand, pointed at Dacia's head, and the gun went off. She died a few days later after a decision had to be made by her single mother. So we ended up having the funeral at the church where we were. Most of the people who came to the funeral were not people who usually went to church, and we didn't really know very many of them, but we had tried to plan a service that would honor her life and would share the gospel with people. This was in a big old church building, and our offices were on one floor and then the sanctuary upstairs on another floor. We always walked up this little back stairway to get up there. And as we were going up that stairway, I said to my husband, I don't know if there are any children up there or not, but if there are children, I'm going to do a children's message. Well, when we got up there, there were quite a few of her schoolmates who were there, 6- and 7-year-olds who were there. So I did a little children's message, and I reminded them of 3 things. Some of them had been present when Dacia had been shot, and they knew she had been in the hospital for a few days. So I reminded them that Dacia was no longer in pain, that all of her pain was gone. And I reminded them as well that Dacia was never alone, that her mommy was with her the whole time she was in the hospital. And then when she passed away, God was waiting for her with open arms. She was never alone. The third thing I reminded those children of is that they should not be afraid to be good. That they had probably heard people say, only the good die young. And that's why this little girl had died. And I wanted to remind them that that's not true. That they shouldn't be afraid to be good. That none of us knew why Dacia had died. That it was very sad and a tragedy and an accident. But that it wasn't because she was good and that God hadn't killed her, although I didn't use those words with the children. I think we need to be aware of that right now too. If there's anything in your theology that you're working on now, it ought to be theodicy, figuring out where evil fits in the world. Because all of you have either seen something on Facebook or Twitter or had somebody say to you, God is doing this to bring us closer together as families, or to teach us how to do new things in the church. And what I want to say is, God is not killing thousands of people so we can learn how to do Bible study on Zoom. Someone once said, don't attribute anything to God that would be a crime if anybody else did it. But the reason people are doing that is because we're trying to make meaning out of this. So figure out how, with the people that you work with, you are going to help them make meaning. Have your theodicy in mind. And remember that I don't know is always a legitimate answer to a question, especially when we're talking about something like this. You need to have your own idea of salvation and atonement pretty much in hand so that you can share it with other people. For me, it's something like this, that what we're celebrating this week was really a contest between good and evil. And it was a very close thing because the Son of God died. Evil almost won. But then Easter morning came. And so we know once and for all with sure and certain hope that God wins, that good wins, and that we can count on that. Because as Paul reminded the people whom he had never met at Rome when he wrote a letter to them, we know that we are conquerors through the one who loves us. Because he said, I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. I wish you well as you lead people through this time and as you take your own heart through this time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Reverend Crummell. This has been a powerful time of sharing. We've had a lot to process, some solid information. I think one of the most, from Reverend Crummell's comments, the importance of not rushing to make meaning was incredibly insightful. This is a time for us to kind of sit with what's happening collectively. And part of that also is happening here on this call. So we do have at least one question to start with. And our presenters are aware of the question. I'm going to ask Stacey Williams to take a shot at the first question. I'll read it out loud for those who are on the phone and are not able to see the chat. The question is, Dr. Williams said something about collective trauma needing a collective response. The person is wondering practically, how can that happen given the diversity of experiences of the members of our communities, where some have previous incidents of trauma, some have better coping mechanisms than others? How do we as faith community leaders help to move a community towards health and healing, as well as the individual members of community? So that's the first question. We're going to ask Stacey Williams to take a shot at it and follow it up by Devona, and I'm hoping that will give Reverend Crummell a moment to catch her breath and see if she has something to offer as well. And for the rest of us, please continue to forward your questions for the Q&A.
It definitely is a complex question that needs a complex answer. So I'll provide some thoughts, but I absolutely hope Devona and Sue, you jump in as well. Before I start on that question, Dr. Crumpton, I wanted to make sure that you saw another question that was higher up about individuals. So see if you can find that question.
I'll take a look.
But in this particular specific question, you know, we start talking about universal precautions. The Substance Abuse Mental Health Research Site, SAMHSA, offers some really helpful, they call it the 4 R's of trauma responsiveness. And so the first R is that we realize that trauma is real. I think that those of us within the field of trauma and resilience, I think COVID-19 has accelerated this piece of our work tremendously. So it's realizing that trauma is real, and then recognizing the signs and symptoms. And that's where work like this, continuing to educate yourselves, and what I would say as faith communities and leaders in the faith community, those that you have around you that are cultivating that space, whatever that might be, getting them trained to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms is extremely beneficial. And then once we recognize the signs and symptoms, or as, not that that's a finished thing, but as you grow in that, you start to develop a toolbox of ways to respond. And so it's really a matter of being attuned to what's going on with your community that you might be leading, being sensitive, being aware of the collective experiences that might be going on for them when they come to you and what they're bringing with them, so that you can select targeted, helpful ways to be affirming and responsive to those needs. So an example that I might give is that we know that trauma is coursing through our body and that it causes stress hormones. But there also are ways that we can activate what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's our calming system. And that's what regulates things. That's our breath. That's what releases dopamine and serotonin and the good hormones that calm our brain and body. Something as simple as a warm greeting with a smile can literally have a physiological effect that de-stresses the person who is in the vicinity of that greeting. It is that powerful. So you can ensure that your folks in ministry with you that are greeting and welcoming people, that it's everybody gets greeted with a warm greeting and a welcoming smile. And already you've taken a very strategic and targeted and strong trauma responsive approach to that setting. We do not need to know everybody's individual trauma history in order to be trauma responsive. However, part of that is moving into the fourth R, which is resisting re-traumatization. And in that way, there are important things to have as resources readily available. I really believe that faith communities should have clinicians on staff because there are individuals struggling to cope with the realities of trauma that need that additional help. And so a couple things I wanted to point to in response to this question. One is that I'm more and more hearing about faith communities that are taking the adverse childhood experiences study. There's several surveys that are have been adapted for faith communities, and they're having their whole faith community, they're offering it to take it. And it can help you know, we call it an ACEs score. And it's very empowering, which is one of the pathways to healing, is to be empowered in your own healing. And so it can be very powerful to just know, what are we up against? And then how can I take steps towards doing something about that, which is also a very powerful part of coping with and healing from trauma, is being able to do something about it. So another step, and I'm actually actively working on this for areas that I'm teaching in, is called the sanctuary model. And I'll make sure that these are included in the slides. That's what I was working on shortly, so I'll make sure we have those ready. The sanctuary model comes out of the work of Dr. Bloom, and it was started within mental health institutions in the 80s, but has since grown to being a highly effective developed model for institutions and organizations in every field. And I think that it is the opportunity that faith communities can take as very practical, guided, research-based, strong practices that have become very practical and simplified in the field. So it's called the sanctuary model. And I'll put a link to a really helpful website that gives very strategic steps to create trauma-informed practices that promote well-being and develop resilience and build strength and have pathways towards healing as a universal precaution. Because now, more than ever, we can assume that everybody has a level of trauma.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to ask Reverend Devona if you can pick up, and also there's an additional question I think about persuading someone who has lived with, particular to in the congregation, within the congregation, just as Stacy just addressed, but also particular to people who have lived with childhood trauma for decades. How do we, they may be particularly traumatized, how do we also help them in particular, persuade them, support them, encourage them, support them towards getting help?
Got it. While I'm talking, I'm going to go ahead and reshare this slide so that you all
Thank
can
you.
have it. To answer the question, one of the things about helping others, it involves a level of that same introspection. As faith leaders, as clinicians, we have to be aware of our own trauma response in response to other people. And often we rush to fix things. This person is depressed. I need to get them out of it. I think we need to practice presence with people, because maybe we can't change, we definitely can't change the spread of the virus and how things are happening beyond our own power. But one of the things we can do is just be with someone in that place. And our ability to tap into our emotions allows us to sit with someone who is there without having to change it. It's like, okay, I can't get you out, but I can be here in with you. And our acknowledgement of our own traumatic response and what to do about that will allow us to have that level of presence. When it comes to inviting somebody into a therapeutic process or having them go and seek their own services, I think one of the first things we can do is be a good model. Are we taking care of ourselves mentally? And then we can say without any shame, because there's no need for it, yeah, you know, I talk to a therapist. My therapist has a therapist. And this is to help in addition to faith. It's not opposed to. I think our work requires some psychoeducation that therapy, psychology is not apart from spirituality at all. I do trauma informed spiritually integrative therapy, trauma therapy, and I talk about how God is doing the work between us in this intersubjective space. And so if you can really frame counseling in a spiritual context, people begin to see it more. And then just being very clear, hey, I think you're struggling. I think maybe your life is in danger. This can help. And who doesn't need more help, right? And so it's a matter of framing, being a good model yourself, and just being attuned to what's happening in you.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much. Those are really practical tips from both of you all. Thank you so much. Reverend Crummell, do you have anything to offer to the questions, the question that as it has been posed? And then I also have an additional question for you, Reverend Crummell.
I saw the question about uncertainty. Is that the additional one that you're referring to? In any case, I'll talk about the uncertainty just a minute. The question has to do with there are some people who are kind of in the place of Naomi right now, where things have kind of run out and they're uncertain, especially not knowing when all of this will end. It strikes me that we have a lot of ancestors in the faith who also faced great times of uncertainty. When the people came out the other end of the Red Sea, they had no idea what was coming next. They did not know how to be the people of God. I remember when I was little, I used to think, wow, they really didn't get directions very well. They had to wander around for 40 years and they didn't go all that far. Well, that's not the point, of course. God kept them out there wandering around for 40 years until they learned how to be the people of God. And so they had all that time of uncertainty. And I'm struck too, especially the day it is, that the people on Friday who walked away from the foot of the cross faced uncertainty like they had never known before. They thought they had found the one to follow. They thought they kind of got what Jesus' point was, and then they watched him die on the cross. Talk about uncertainty. They just had no idea what was to come next. So I think, at least for me, that helps a little bit to remember that we're not alone in the uncertainty and not alone in not knowing when will this end, how will it end, will I see the end, all of those things. Lots of our ancestors in the faith faced the same thing and were to various degrees faithful in those times of uncertainty. And so I hope that people can find some solace and some strength and guidance maybe in thinking about some of those people who went before us who also faced times of uncertainty.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to give you a breather and I'm going to wrap around to another question. There is a question that came up from someone, but I'm having a little challenge getting it to everybody. So I'm going to switch gears and give myself a minute to get the question out. But this question is to the entire panel. As an Asian American, I am wondering what can be done to help Asian Americans who are experiencing almost dual trauma with racism and COVID-19 occurring at the same time? What can leaders do to help in a virtual way without re-traumatizing their community? Again, as an Asian American, which by the way is being hate crimes against Asian Americans, and anyone who people presume phenotypically is Chinese, right? Asian Americans are being targeted, and the person is wondering what can be done to help Asian Americans who are experiencing dual trauma, especially in terms of hate crimes with racism and COVID occurring at the same time. What can leaders do to help in a virtual way without re-traumatizing the community? And that's open to any of the panelists if they would like to get into that one.
I would say just validate the reality of it, right? I think often in communities of color, one of our coping mechanisms has been to just go as if we're not affected. Let's act as if I'm not harmed by this. I think for faith leaders in the Asian community is to acknowledge, no, this is a real thing and it does cause pain. It does hurt. Validating what's happening first, I think, is the first step of helping people. Beyond that, safety first. One of those first things that SAMHSA lays out for trauma is recognizing that there is a threat and ensure safety. Try to maintain emotional safety. Gather with other people that you feel safe with, and then connect with allies for sure, who will, like all of us, I'm sure, in this group, who will speak on behalf of those who are suffering and against oppression.
Awesome. Any of the other panelists want to chime in on that one? Okay, we've got another question. Someone's thinking of all the funerals that are being postponed. Is there any advice for how a faith community should proceed post-COVID-19 if there are several funerals that have already been postponed? It seems that multiple services, even memorial services, would be re-traumatizing, or might that be a needed step for healing? Again, they're thinking of all the funerals that are being postponed. Is there any advice for how faith community should proceed post-COVID-19 if there are several funerals that have been postponed? It seems multiple services, even memorial services, would be re-traumatizing, or might that be a needed step for healing?
I think probably that the leaders of communities of faith need to talk to each family about what they want to do when there is a time when people can gather, because it might be different for different families. My husband happens to be a pastor of a church, and he had a funeral yesterday and he has a funeral tomorrow. There were 8 people there yesterday. I don't know how many people will be there tomorrow. I don't know whether those families will want to have a larger celebration of the deceased's life at some point, or whether for those families this was the funeral. But I think for each family it will be different. Another thing that some congregations do is, for instance, on All Saints' Day, remember the lives of all those who have been lost in the last year in that congregation, with some kind of ritual, lighting of candles or remembrance or something like that. So it might be that for particular congregations it would work to do some community kind of remembrance of those who have passed. But then also, kind of a memorial service, but a celebration of the resurrection as well. So it might not be as focused on a particular person's life. There might not be quite as many, tributes to a particular person, but to remember how our faith gives us meaning, even at the time of death, and for a community of faith to move forward like that.
I would like to add to that. Thank you, Sue. Exactly. A piece of the collective healing is going to be some type of collective remembering that'll be important. And absolutely, it will be different processes for different families, but there's much to be drawn on the rituals of Indigenous folks around the world who have come from collectivist communities that aren't so steeped in the individualism that we are here, that have much to learn for us about collective ritual and collective remembrance. If you recall, the traumatic event can be all of these things, natural disasters and illness and all of these things, but also the invisibilizing of personhood. And when we talk about how entire people groups can be invisibilized, or the struggle in this COVID-19 time to be able to have these rituals of remembrance, we're talking about the threat of invisibilizing. And it's important to pay attention to that, so that even however you can set up phone trees or communication trees so that no one who loses someone during this time goes without a touch, reaching out, a call, a card, something that says we see you is going to be as important as ever, but even more important at this time because of that threat.
Thank you so much. Looks like we have one more question here, and I'm also indicating here that we're going to be wrapping up pretty soon, so we're asking for people, if you have any final thoughts or questions, to go ahead and add them to the chat. We do have one here. In particular, this is coming to folks who are in ministry and on the call, so Reverend Crummell and also Reverend Aline. While there is a lot of win-loss language, in terms of why is there victory kind of questions hard baked into our faith speech, especially in this week, how would you tease out that kind of language from the type of theodicy problematic language you've highlighted? I believe the person is speaking to you, Reverend Crummell, language you've highlighted in terms of God is doing this because. It feels that death/losing, life/winning constructions bolster the type of theodicy logic that's too readily available. This person is a hospice grief counselor, and they're concerned that that kind of language sets up some real challenges for helping people to come to terms with death, in terms of why did this person die, which becomes why did they lose. Any help on teasing this out would be appreciated.
I think just figuring out a way to put your own theology of the atonement into whatever words make most sense to you and within your own denomination or your tradition. And that was the point of what I was trying to say, is that if you have some sense of what makes most sense to you, to share that. But I've thought too, some of the talk about who is most at risk for this almost makes it sound like it's an STD or something. Like it's something that you've done something you shouldn't have done, and that's why you got sick. And of course, that happens a lot with almost any kind of illness that, you know, people try to figure out, why are they sick? Because I want to make sure that I'm not going to get sick. And so you make these lines between, well, they did that, I don't do that, so I'm not going to. But some of the language that I hear in the news conferences and some other things on TV, it's almost like a blaming of people or something of why they are more at risk for this particular thing, or, you know, they did something they shouldn't have done. And that then sets up that win-loss. The other thing is we often use that win-loss language about, well, I hear it especially about cancer. You know, somebody fought a battle against, or they lost their battle. Okay, well, that also makes it sound like it was partly their fault, you know, that they couldn't fight hard enough. And I guess that was partly the point that I wanted to make, is that we shouldn't assign fault in this. We don't know what's happening. We don't know why this is happening. But to have beneath what we're sharing with people, that assurance that we do know that the story of Easter is that good triumphed over evil. And I don't know another verb to use that doesn't have that kind of language attached to it. So that was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah. I want to speak to this crisis of meaning that comes up when we're acting in having traumatic effects, right? Whether it's childhood trauma or whatever that's coming up in this, that crisis of meaning leads people to start making meaning of things just to feel better. And I think that's where that language comes in about why did this happen? What did you do? And you sound like Job's friends, right? A lot of people come to me in the counseling office to work out some of these things. And the question I ask is, who do you know God to be? And is God God, or is God a representation of a human person, a parent or someone? And what are you personifying God with to suggest that God is punishing someone for doing something? That sounds more human and less divine. So I really work on changing people's God image to say, what kind of a loving God would do something like this? Is this the God you know? And that's where we begin to move away from the punitive God causing these things for some type of good. And that is where, depending on the client, I may share more of my theology. I think in faith spaces, there's more freedom to do that, where you then model, hey, this is how we know God to be. Would God do this? And then leave it to the individual, to work out their own soul salvation. But just to move them away from that, I'm losing, or we're losing, or we've done something to cause this. That's where I tend to go with altering that language a bit.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We've got just a couple of minutes remaining. And so I'm going to throw this out here to anybody who'd like to pick it up. And we're going to have some final comments also. I'm going to throw this last question out, ask for any final closing thoughts from our presenters, and then we'll also have a final word from myself and my co-convener, Barbara Wilson. And the final question is, how do we get people talking about their feelings? And so that's a general question. And to combine it with another question is, how do we create spaces for the healers, the caregivers themselves? How do we create spaces for them to talk about their feelings and their experiences? Anyone who wants to pick it up and add a final closing thought, that would be great.
I'll start. I'm looking forward to hear others' response as well. But so I saw a couple questions that are similar to this in the chat as well. That I would say healing is the work of the individual who needs to do their work. It's all of our own work to be done. So I definitely would love to hear, if those of you, Barbara, Sue, or Devona, have other thoughts on this, but I think I want to caution us from saying, how do we make people do their work? Mm. What we do is we create space that invites people in to spiritual, emotional, physical, psychological well-being. And we model for those of us who have done our own work, the vulnerability and transparency. And I'll model that right now. I have a really high ACEs score, and I share that with people because I have done a lot of work. I don't have answers for the questions of much of the pain that I experienced, but I do know that my really high ACEs score puts me at risk for having a shortened lifespan and numerous health impacts, and not being able to show up in my relationships in the way that I long to be. And so I wrestle spiritually, I wrestle with the Lord, I dig deep, I learn, I study, I grow, and I do yoga, and I become a vegan, and I say, I am not going out like that. I have a lot of work to do, and I want to live well. And so how do we then be inviters into health and wellness for others? And I think a big part of it is happening right now because we normalize the conversation. We say, this is affecting all of us. How is it getting in you? Have you noticed? I was on a group chat. I said, have you noticed that the simplest thoughts are so hard? And the strangest thoughts are coming to mind, like rewiring my outlets that are broken. I never would have thought that I could do that by myself when I was thinking, under normal circumstances, but somehow I think that's something I should take on. Back away from the wall, put the screwdriver down. It's not your expertise. And just normalizing what are we feeling, what's going on, and checking in with folks and saying, hey, I'm having a rough day. How are you? So that people can be invited in to be able to say, yeah, actually, this is really hard. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I like that, Stacy. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's real for all of us. As faith leaders, I think we have to acknowledge what we're dealing with and then invite people by saying, this space that I'm in is safe enough for you to. Safe enough for you to be real because I'm being real. And I know often congregations will put us on pedestals. Deliberately step off the pedestal, especially in this situation, and just be. Because when you're being, you invite people to be themselves as well.
The other thing I've been reminding pastors and other minister members of the presbytery about is none of us know what we're doing. None of us know how to do this. There are no experts on this. And, you know, sometimes pastors or other leaders have this feeling that somebody's going to come to them and say, well, the last pastor who took us through a global pandemic did it a lot better than you. Well, nobody can say that to you. It doesn't exist. So we just all have to be gentle with ourselves and realize we're doing the best we can. And sometimes it's not going to work. And then there'll be another day to try again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Our parting shot from our co-convener, Barbara Wilson.
Well, everyone, my heart is truly filled with gratitude. And what I wanted to lift out is just quickly some things that I heard from all three presenters. There is this focus on both and not either or. I heard the understanding that we need all folks at the table, all in. We need professionals, clinicians, clergy. We need folks who are working on the ground, who have other skill sets and gifting. And we all have to choose to do our inner work, which is ongoing, to create that space, to hold the tension and the ambiguity, and to do that with some transparency, with grace, and holding on to confident hope, and with compassion and empathy for ourselves first. And I just want to say, I appreciate the connecting of the dots in that way. Education, science, information, the practicality of where we live every day and how we can lean into our being and who we are and what we believe as we do together, both individually and collectively, and to do all of that from our own spiritual understanding. So it's phenomenal, and I want to say thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to my co-convener. Thank you for everybody who has joined, especially the questions that help us go even deeper. We appreciate you. We hope to see you. Hope you will join us next Thursday when we will have another set of presenters, and our focus will be on vulnerable children in times of crisis and parenting in times of crisis and stress. See you next Thursday for the ongoing Trauma Symposium with McCormick Theological Seminary, 12 p.m. until 1:30 on Thursdays in the month of April. Take care, be well, be good to yourselves.
Yes.
Thank you. Take care.